Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is Verity Seeker, and this is the third in a series of three podcasts that we're doing with Dr. Polsley, Dr. Cynthia Cara Polsley. And Dr. Polsley, I'm going to go ahead and call you by your first name on this one because this is going to be an unscripted interview. And it's okay if I call you Cara?
Yes, go right ahead.
All right. You're aware of what's going on in our society today. Our government's basically being dismantled. It's not what it used to be. And as a matter of fact, you and I probably don't know what a real federal republic is supposed to look like, what real liberty looks like. What do you think's going on right now, just to get this ball rolling?
Well, so one of the things that I deal a lot with is narrative and how you get to where you are. So in looking at where we are now, it seems like you can pinpoint a lot on it and say it's a trajectory from the past that has been coming up for a while. And where we are now is both really off course for us as people who want a constitutional republic, want healthy churches, want a healthy structure, and really on course for those who, quite frankly, don't.
Okay. Now, what do you think happened, or when do you think it happened? You say it's a process. You know, I take it all the way back to the War for Southern Independence, or some people refer to it as the Civil War. I think we started going off the rails even that far back governmentally as far as our system. But as far as in our time, say in the 60s, what do you think is the mission of the socialist or the communist agenda?
1960s, if we talk about that era, we see so many of the things like you're talking about, one era and all of these different times in the process that demonstrates the, I'll say, seed coming to fruition in a way. We look at 1960s now and we say, oh, it was the cause of so many of these things, which obviously isn't what you're saying because you're tracing it back to the 1800s as well. But instead of putting blame on solely the 1960s, you know, we do need to look back and say, where did that process actually start? Well, if you start tracing back and back, you can find a really consistent narrative that does go through all the things that lead through the 1960s, going back through up to Civil War period. But if we're looking at what they actually want to accomplish, you know, in many ways, I just look at it and say, well, what are they saying they want to accomplish? And in many regards, today in America, where we are right now, 2021, we're coming the second year of COVID, things that changed our societal structure completely, and I'll say overtly, because it only shows changes that were happening below that people were becoming more and more prepared to accept. But where we're headed from there, you can see many of the social influencers already saying. There are a lot of groups out there on the big stage globally who are saying it's time to have international oversight of health and safety, of public goods, of production. There is, of course, I know you're familiar with the United Nations Agenda of 2030, which speaks of a global cooperative, essentially, to have all people operating under one umbrella. Now, they'll say there are nation states and still nations, but we do need to be very, very wary, of course, of whatever they say. So all these things that where we say, where are we going? We look at today and say, well, you know, they're saying 2030, they have a world in mind. So we should be looking at what they actually are already saying. And that's stuff available with the UN. Anyone can Google that and find it.
That's right.
You can Google something called the Great Reset, which happens to coincide with the 2030 year. You can look to some of the works of what their forefathers themselves were saying and what they wanted to accomplish. And it all has a really consistent goal that matches what the 2030 agenda and those things show.
So what basically, of course, we're going to kind of go back and we're going to talk about some of these players, I guess I could say, but do you believe that the United Nations, the guy that, the German author that wrote the book, The Great Reset.
Klaus Schwab.
Yeah. Do you think all of these people, you know, Bill Gates, even Fauci, George Soros, the Vatican, do you think that all of them are working in cooperative parallels? Do you think they're working together for the same end, or do you think they're competing for world control or dominance of the New World Order?
Well, in many ways, it depends on the person in the group. It's the ideology that is very consistent. And so that's the thing, when we talk about 1960s, when we talk about today and all of those, you look at what's behind all of it and you say, okay, well, how consistent are their claims about what they want to accomplish, in the framework that they are using to put their own words? And, something that we don't tend to notice, I think, is how much there's an ideology behind everything. And that's true of a Disney movie. It's true of a college course, that there's always a framework that's being imparted to you. This is something, we talk about this a lot in grammatical studies, and in the last interview we talked about ifscapes and contrafactuals and this idea of contrary to fact conditions. Well, all the time when we speak, we're always doing it with an eye to some perspective, right? And all these people who are movers and shakers today have some perspective, some ideology that's driving it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we take what they say at face value and we look at it and say, okay, how much does it match up with this person is saying? And sometimes it's really, really obvious. We just let them speak for themselves.
Right. Yeah, and one thing I've noticed about I don't know how you feel about the Vatican, but my mother's really into it because she's a Catholic. Okay. And she is just all over the Pope all the time. And, there are Catholics that want to cleanse their tradition and their practices, to keep it honest. And then you have our own government, and the same things seem to be happening simultaneously. It's almost like they're being usurped in parallel. So I was just curious how you felt about that, whether all these people are working in concert with each other, or, jockeying for, to get on top. You just don't know. But like you said, it sure seems like sometimes they are.
You look at the things they sign when they're working together, or the things that they pump out, and they, sometimes, and we probably will talk about the Humanist Manifesto or something like that, these documents that were written in 1933, 1973, and 2003. And you have dozens of people who are signing these documents. And like I said, the last one's updated in 2003. Well, you're going across almost 100 years, 70 years, and the ideology is consistent. Now, the people are across the board. Mm-hmm. You have teachers, you have ministers, you have, everything you can think of, journalists, all these. But the ideology they're espousing, the underlying core of it that they keep coming back to, is this evolved order that will become globalized at some point. And they're saying, we expect it to be soon. That's what the 2030 agenda is all about. And there's a very consistent ideology indicated in all of those things.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that COVID was a catalyst to get these agendas back on track? For instance, the United Nations Agenda 2021. Do you think it was the catalyst that they needed to have, along with climate change, to get them back on schedule so they would be ready for 2021 and then prepped for Agenda 30?
It's a big question, and it comes up so often. And if you're just going from indications, you have to look at it and say, well, I can't say what started the virus. I can't say, but I can say that they do say when these crises come up, when they're engineered or they're natural or whatever they are, that you shouldn't waste them. And that's something that is very, very consistent. And that's something that in all of these things we've already even discussed, 2030 plans, Humanist Manifesto things, 1960s all over the place, you always see this consistent end goal in mind. Mm-hmm. And we all have seen around the world how much COVID has been used as a catalyst to propel us towards so many things that they want to accomplish. And this isn't me saying this. You can go and you Google World Economic Forum, Google UN 2030, and you can find these things in print where they say, COVID has changed the face of the world. Now is our opportunity. Let's move forward.
Yeah, that's right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because they're not bothered by mentioning it. It's not in secret anymore.
No, I mean, we've reached a point where those things are pretty open now, yeah. And people are used to that idea.
Yeah, and that tells me personally that they feel the power. They're far enough along. This agenda has developed far enough, and is embedded enough throughout our entire infrastructure and our society, actually worldwide, that they feel very confident, I should say, in just telling it like it is. That means they are confident that they're at that point where they're winning.
Well, and a good example of that is, as a millennial, I know so many people who are my age and they say, I don't want to own private property. Give me everything that will be on my cell phone and I'll download everything. I can order everything I want. I'll rent everything. They have food orders. They have places you can rent clothing and laundry and everything now.
Yeah.
And this move towards something that's public ownership, always rental, always having a stake in it, all of that connects to things that they have been taught about private ownership being a negative thing. And that is another thing, if you trace back to all of the things we've already discussed, it's a consistent talking point.
Yeah.
And they consider it something that is, if you ask them about it, they say, well, it's better for the environment. It's more equitable and sustainable. It's green. It supports better infrastructure. It's just. And you hear all those buzzwords over and over and over again. Not an accident.
Yeah, you're right. So you mentioned the word just. That, something triggered in my mind there, social justice. How does that play into all of this? It's an ideology, right?
Yeah, so social justice as a buzzword, this is not a new thing. And people think that social justice, wokeness, this idea that we're being awakened from sleeping like we were before, are new ideas. But the truth is we can track them back, and very, very much from their own sources. And I say I should make it really specific. I'm not talking about Bill Gates' grandfather. I'm talking about, ideologically speaking, the people who are talking about social justice in the 1800s share much of a same framework with the people who are today. However, when we talk about justice, we have to be really on our toes. It's a careful thing that we have to be doing. And that's as Christians, it's as people who, if you're not a Christian, it still is the same way. We have to understand that words have changed meanings. Mm-hmm. And with social justice, that's one of the biggest examples of it. Because we've moved from something in American history, for instance, the Founding Fathers had read William Blackstone. And Blackstone speaks of justice. He speaks of natural law, which is in the physics around us, nature around us, things that are imparted to us through creation or conscience given by God. He says there's also a revealed law. And he says that's the Bible. Well, the Founding Fathers put their justice on that. And that's true of Benjamin Franklin. It's true of Thomas Jefferson. So when they speak of justice, they're speaking in a classical justice framework. Now, regardless of whether or not you believe they were Christians, that's not even part of the argument, because we can trace it back to Cicero, who was not. That's right. We can trace it back to Plato's Republic. That type of justice, which is called to each his own, goes way back to Plato in the 400s, and he's quoting poets who were centuries before him, saying justice is about being honest, giving someone what is his due, what is owed him. And that's something that justice doesn't mean today, because modern justice now doesn't mean equal opportunity. It doesn't mean being honest, trying to do your best. It has those words. But if you read the documentation of things ranging from 1800s to today, you see the very consistent line of thought is that justice is about an equal outcome, redistribution that will arrange equality for everyone. And they say, well, if we can give equal outcomes, then everyone gets an equal opportunity.
Wow. Okay. How did we get to this point? Do you think it was done through the educational system? I've heard that beginning in the 1900s, that was the beginning of the progressive capture of our public school or state-funded institutions. Have they been teaching or programming us to, or actually reprogramming the narrative, the verbiage that describes what we're supposed to have, and basically fundamentally transforming how we think?
Well, it's all that thing about framework, isn't it? You're always shifting the paradigm, always affecting the paradigm, and education is one of the greatest ways to do that. And if you trace back, we start today with 2021, we're looking at 2030 and saying, what is this thing with this sudden end goal that's popped up? Well, it's not sudden. And you heard a lot of people last year who said, how did we get to this point in America where in 2020 we see this happening? What world is this?
Yeah.
Well, you shift back a little bit. We've already talked a little bit about the humanist manifestos, the ideas they had for an evolved human consciousness, basically, an evolved human outcome. We can trace back beyond that. And personally, as a Christian, I will say I think a lot of it started when the churches began to not teach biblical inerrancy, when they started to believe that the church was teaching relative truth. Because if there's no firm foundation, there's no firm value in the first place, justice doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. Now, on a secular level, if we trace that back, because this doesn't have to be tied to exactly, if you don't believe the church has any part in it, well, look at the secular sources too. And let's look back at what a couple of them say. So let's put the Humanist Manifesto aside. Let's look at some of the people who signed it. One of them is John Dewey. John Dewey is known as the father of progressive education. Mm-hmm. And one of John Dewey's biggest things was that individualism needed to be basically subsumed under an umbrella of a common good, and that children could reach their full potential under that umbrella better than they could reach it in a system that was more individually based, more privately based, if you will. Mm-hmm. And he's just one example, but he changed the entire education system. It's completely remodeled. And if you read John Dewey's works, you see that he focuses on democracy. And so the scholars who read John Dewey say, well, after him, the education system really focused on democracy. Well, there's a reason for that too. Take a look at that in a minute. But another signer was Maxine Greene. I'm not picking on the manifesto, by the way. I'm just looking at the ideology, saying,
right.
We're running backwards here. Maxine Greene actually died recently in 2014. She worked at Columbia University, Teachers College, and she was a philosopher who was involved in the philosophy of education. Again, very interested in this idea of equality, redistribution. Well, where are people like Maxine Greene and John Dewey getting their ideas? Well, you go back to generations before them. And we can go back to Edward Bellamy is a really good example. So that's the late 1890s, 1880s. 1887, Edward Bellamy publishes this work called Looking Backward. And he said this is a romantic novel. It's a fiction. But it was stated at the time. He put it in fiction because he knew people weren't quite willing or ready to listen to an economic treatise of that length. However, you read what he says in the treatise, and the character, his name's Julian West. He wakes up in the year 2000, and he sees a transformed world. Everything is a corporate, one nation, everything is connected to the sole employer of the nation. And West's conversations with his hosts repeatedly come back to this thing about individualism is bad. True capitalism, true democracy came to complete fruition in basically a communist society. So it completely turns terms on its head, and it begins this idea that democracy is about complete equality of outcome.
Wow. And no mention of mob rule.
No, in Bellamy's book, it all transitioned very peacefully.
Yeah.
And he says, we have credit cards, but with the credit cards, the nation pays for everything. And someone will say, well, but isn't that the same thing? If you take it off the credit card, the nation may be paying you to have that credit. But in the book, it's this, you have it both ways. Yeah,
it's interesting. They're utopian ideas about democracy and, their vision of how things should be, but they never think beyond that. What are the consequences of that? Democracy is an evil system because it allows the mob to rule over the innocent or the others, whether they're innocent or not. You can have a kind mob of people and it works great. But when the time comes and you get an evil, oppressive mob of people or a ruler who has coerced or convinced a mob of people to kill or destroy blocks of city buildings, there is no law there. It doesn't exist anymore. They're supposed to have a republican system of governance where it's consistent. Like you talked about, natural law is a consistent law. You can't negotiate it. But it's allowed in situations like that, and people don't get that about democracy and the ideologies that Dewey and others were dreaming up at the time.
It is so fickle. You know, that's why the founding fathers looked at it and said, we want a constitutional republic. We need those checks and balances.
Yep.
And why we can't have a living constitution that actually is a functional framework for a system.
Yeah.
Well, this is exactly where we come full circle with the conversation about democracy and justice in the first place. Because when you treat those like they aren't absolutes, you can take them anywhere.
Yeah.
And say that's the logical outcome. And you know, the other thing about that is, I mean, the whole fact that we don't live in a democracy, that was so subtly changed. Mm-hmm. You know, and you look back, that's another thing around the time of Edward Bellamy, after his book, they suddenly had over 100 Bellamy clubs in the United States that popped up. Farmers, you know, everyday workers saying, we want what this man is telling us. It sounds great. It sounds glorious. Let's do it. Saying the elevation of man is the highest principle. That's a paraphrase from one of the founding clubs, which the first one was in Boston the year after. And, you know, with all of that, that was around the time the Social Democrat Party was doing pretty well. And they actually have quotes in their handbooks of social democracy where they say social democracy is another term for democratic socialism. So they do this switch of terms, and nobody really talks about it that way anymore. They all assume it, and then if you push on it too hard, then you will get people who admit and say, well, yeah, so democracy is pure socialism.